Oh yay, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay, oh yay.
Willkommen, bienvenue, welcome. No, this is not cabaret, it's Think About It, a podcast about the power of ideas and how language can change the world, with Uli Baer. In an essay called Tradition and Individual Talent, the poet T.S. Eliot wrote, "What happens when a new work of art is created is something that happens simultaneously to all the works of art that preceded it." Chinua Achebe's 1958 novel Things Fall Apart achieves this. It reorders the entire canon and allows us to think about what the English language is capable of, what the novel can do, and how to account for the individual imagination as the most powerful force in changing the world. Join me in the conversation with Professor Manthia Diawara, himself a renowned filmmaker and writer, to discuss the lasting impact of Chinua Achebe's masterpiece, which was published 60 years ago this year. Welcome to Think About It. I'm thrilled to be here today with Professor Manthia Diawara, who's a filmmaker, a writer, a critic, also holds the title of university professor at New York University. Manthia, we've known each other for a long time. I think of you always as a French, Parisian, cosmopolitan New Yorker, also from Mali. So you grew up in Bamako and then you were educated in Europe and studied at Indiana University, taught at the University of California at Santa Barbara, the University of Pennsylvania, and now you've been my colleague here. So welcome, first of all, to the podcast. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you for having me, Uli. I'm happy to be doing this program.
So what I wanted to talk about is Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Achebe, Nigerian novelist, published this novel in 1958. Things Fall Apart is considered today one of the most important novels written in the canon of world literature. It's also been talked about a lot as the first African novel written in English. It's not quite the first, but maybe the most important one. When Achebe was in university, which was called University College in Nigeria, he studied medicine originally, and then his teachers, he published a few short stories, his teachers probably indulged him a bit, but relatively quickly discouraged him and didn't take it seriously, the idea that an African could write stories or a novel that would be taken seriously. Achebe talked about this throughout his life, that initially he was told, kind of, it's a nice hobby, but don't even try. And there's more behind that kind of discouragement and Achebe's decision to nonetheless write this book. So can you say a little bit about how you probably have been teaching this book for a long time. What is the importance of Things Fall Apart for anyone today, not just for people from Nigeria or from the Igbo region of Nigeria or British people, but why has this novel become such a touchstone for how we understand what the novel can do?
Well, Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, you're right. People refer to this novel as the first African novel. The dates do not matter that much because there are prior novels in Africa. But people consider it as the first African novel because it has a way to Africanize the English language and the novel tradition. It's the first African novel because Achebe was able, in this particular book, this first book, to question the novel after reading books like Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, to try to look at Africa from inside, to give Africans a subjectivity, to, in a way, show an African worldview which includes religion, which is very important. They say Africans do not have a religion. Individualism, which is also very important because people think that African are just communities, but also reversing the eye to have Africans looking at Europeans, because in many ways we've read novels where even the best novels, well-intentioned modernists, were still looking at Africans. This is the first novel that's actually looking at Europeans in Africa. So it's a very important novel in that sense. Why am I making a big deal about the language? This is the first novel that you can go to that's not meta language, that's primary language, but yet that give you a sense of African orality. For example, there is a moment where the main character, Okonko, comes home and he find out that somebody had cut the banana tree. He's really upset. He said, "Who killed the banana tree?" Now, in the Western sense, we don't say killing the banana tree, even though today with environmentalism we may say that. But he said, "Who killed the banana tree?" Because trees had spirit the same way human beings have spirit. So you refer to a tree as a character as important as human characters. So there are many instances of that in the novel. It's really in terms of style, in terms of content, in terms of showing the world that Africans have a culture, a civilization equal to the culture and civilization of anyone else. It is probably still one of the best African novels. All the African novels have to measure themselves still to Things Fall Apart.
That's a grand statement 60 years after its publication, and it puts a very high bar for what the novel is. To go back to this first point, you said it tells the story about Africa from within the African perspective. Can you say something about this? What's the role of the novel in general? It tells us not about other people living somewhere. It's not actually a travel guide to discover other people, but novels have a way to put you into a world, and it's yet a worldview. So how does that actually work? When people read this book, they think, oh, am I now sort of visiting this Nigerian village and looking at these people? It's not quite like that.
It's not like that. You're right. The purpose, the ways in which the novel distinguished itself from the epic, for example, or from the romance, is this astuce, this ruse of going in the mind of the characters. Going in their mind in order to judge time, in order to judge space, in order to show kind of subjectivities that affect individuals as characters in the novel. So the novel is unique in that sense. It's wonderful. When you come to Things Fall Apart, what's great is that this novel opens right away with the main character, Okonko, who is embarrassed to be the son of his father, Unoka, because Unoka had no titles. And in this culture, the Igbo culture that the novel is talking about, a man is judged by the number of titles he has earned. And Okonko's father has no title. So he was really, his whole life, he's afraid of failing like his father.
When you're saying Okonko lives with this weight on his shoulder that his father didn't achieve what he thought he should have achieved, there's a couple things to this. There's history, clearly. So he's a historical subject like everybody else in the world. Like from Greek antiquity, we have Oedipus who's suffering from, there's fate. And then there's kind of living your own life apart from this legacy, from where you come from. He wants to differentiate himself, distinguish himself, to live his own life and not be totally overdetermined by where he comes from. So what you said earlier about subjectivity, it's about one person's way of making sense of himself in relation to all these things, some which are present around him, some which are long gone from the past, and some which will be in the future.
Yes, Chinua Achebe is a master storyteller, first of all, because he began this story by throwing, flashbacks. We know that Okonko's father's ghost is going to come back to haunt him. By showing the number of titles Okonko has achieved as one of the best men in the town. So you worry about his fate. If he's so worried about his father, how is he going to go from the beginning of this novel to the end of this novel? So he gives you a lot of clues at the very opening of the novel. We know that Okonko is a strong man with an absolutist idea of masculinity, of identity, and achieving the title of elder in this village. So his fate is already sealed. This is what Okonkwo is going to do. He doesn't like failure. He's masculinist, so he's not going to compromise. And he has a strong sense of identity in an area that we all know that white people will be coming soon. How will this person survive in an environment like that? Yeah.
And that struggle seems to be, or that kind of ambition to define yourself on your own terms and to achieve something. Would you say that's something universal? We all feel this way. We all want to prove ourselves. So you're saying the storytelling part that Achebe starts us out to start identifying with somebody who may be very strange to some people. Say, you're the strong man in a village. I can't relate to this. I live in the modern world. We don't have this anymore. But this is a very universal effort to be yourself, prove yourself.
Yes, it's very universal, but it's also very important because the idea is that Africans do not have a civilization, that Africans cannot create universalism. So what you get in this novel is that as you identify with Okonkwo's point of view as a man troubled with a problem that affected manhood with the Greek, manhood with the Romans, manhood with the Egyptian, all the way to Europe, then you are actually learning a universalism from a particular, the particularity of this small town with a man who's afraid of failure. But he doesn't do it superficially. He puts it in the Igbo cultural context by bringing religion and tradition. Why this man want to have titles? Because to become an elder, you need to earn a lot of titles. So he fights. He farms and get more yam than anybody else. He fights and kills more people than anybody else. He beats up his wives. So it's squarely anchored in the Igbo tradition of manhood. It's also religious because Igbos, unlike the neighbors in this area, whether the Yorubas or the Hausas or the small ethnic minorities, Ijos in the Igbo land, the Igbos, unlike all these groups, believe that a man determines his own destiny and the God follows a man. If a man says yes, his Nchi says also yes. Nchi in this case is the God. If you say yes, your God will say yes. So if you're lazy, simply don't blame your God. It's your problem. So his masculinity is coming from that tradition, really. So it's cultural and it's traditional, but it's universal. Because you will see that in Europe, in France or Germany or Portugal, people ultimately shape their manhood like that. In the United States, manhood is also shaped by the way your tradition tells you this is manly, this is not manly. So
you can't escape this fate. It's really interesting when you're saying this Chi, this God sort of affirms what you do. If you don't take a wrong step, the God will affirm that as well. So you're kind of in sync with it in a certain way. When I read the book, thinking about it now, I don't quite know how to describe Okonkwo he's a hero, he's heroic, he's also, as you said, in some ways deeply flawed. Like all human beings, he makes grave mistakes. We know this from the tradition before the novel. The Greek tradition is all about the heroes who commit grave errors. They're actually never perfect and just are godlike. So he makes these mistakes, and then the culture around him, there are rules and norms. They have very strict rules. They have a tribunal. It feels like the Supreme Court of this village is as magisterial, probably more intact than our Supreme Court. But then there are also norms how to behave. So what we're learning is like every culture has its assumptions about what's proper behavior, what's improper. And so you follow him along in this way, and the novel tries to show us that the world is actually the construction of meaning that we put into it. You don't get born into a world and this is self-evident, but you are participating in shaping it every day.
Right. Yeah. Well, The situation, I think you're absolutely right. He's in some sense a tragic hero. I mean, the way Achebe described Okonkwo physically first, he can only remind me of Achilles. The way, his face looks, he's stern, describe his nose breathing air, his eyes are very, very, tightly shaped. So when you're reading it, you don't want to have lunch with this man. You are afraid of Okonkwo.
You're intimidated, yes,
That's
absolutely.
That's the way Achebe describes him. He's a man, I think you're right, he has tragic flaws. But at the same time, he's a man who is being visited upon by a major change that's going to sweep all of Africa. Colonialism. White people are coming from the first time. So when you are a strong man, you are an elder, you have more titles, how do you behave? That's one of the questions in this novel. And Okonkwo does not have the benefit of reflecting, of thinking a lot. He is a man of action. So his friend next to him, his best friend Obierika, reminds him of that all the time. For example, Obierika said, you should never have taken part in the killing of Ikemefuna because that boy was like your son.
And Ikemefuna is this boy who was handed over to the village in a legal ruling as a kind of way to create a kind of compromise between two conflicting villages. Okonkwo raised him, but then it was legally decided, that he has to be put to death.
Yes.
So he's advised not to do this, but he kind of probably maybe trying to prove how strong he is or that he can determine his own actions. He participates in this killing.
Absolutely.
It's a devastating scene in a way because you're kind of at this point identifying also with this teenage boy whose foster father is guiding him into the forest, and he has a sense of what's going to happen. But it's a really devastating scene because he's kind of killing part of himself to prove how strong he is.
Well, first they gave Ikemefuna to Okonkwo because he's the strongest man in the village. And when he came to Okonkwo's house, he began to call Okonkwo father. And Okonkwo wishes he had a son like Ikemefuna because his own son, Nyoy, is effeminate. His own son, Nyoy, is listening to Christian music coming. His own son is really remind him of his father. Whereas Ikemefuna was working in the field everywhere, every day with Okonkwo. So Okonkwo began to admire Ikemefuna. So when the tribunal put down the judgment that Ikemefuna had to be sacrificed, and you got human sacrifice with the Greeks, you have human sacrifice, all the great works that we know. Okonkwo, the best thing he could have done is, look, I don't want to go against the judgment of the gods, but I don't want to take part into this killing. But Okonkwo does not want to be perceived as feminine. He doesn't now want to be perceived as weak. So he not only marched with all the other people in the middle of the night with this young boy in front of them, but he has a machete and he's the one who's going to cut this young man. And the young man, he could hear him in the dark saying, "Father, they are killing me." So it's really a tragic moment that also is looking at the African's role in the encounter with the outsiders.
Well, listening to you about this scene now makes me think he's participating in killing the part that is the one he would be most proud of, the strongest part, that would actually overcome this legacy of his father's presumed weakness. But where the novel takes us, as you said, this encounter with the colonizers, with white men coming in, the British in this case, there's an end to this. So Okonkwo will not stay as strong because his entire culture is engulfed in another struggle that is not an individual struggle anymore, but it's a struggle between two types of civilization or culture or dominance. So this smallish scene, which is so devastating on a human level, foreshadows that he's actually killing the strong part of himself.
He did. In many ways, after he killed this young boy, Ikemefuna, he alienated everybody, including his best friend. And his son began to look for models in Evil Forest, which is the land that the people in the village, Umuafia, the village is called Umuafia. When white people, the missionaries arrived, they want a place to settle. The villagers looked at each other and said, let's give them Evil Forest. And Evil Forest is where all the bad things are buried, the ancestors.
Wrong side of the tracks.
The wrong side of the track, the snakes and everything. So if these people think they're so good, let's give them Evil Forest. Now Nyoy, Okonko's son, began to hear the chants, the hymns of the Christians in the forest. He began to identify with this. And later on, in the novel, that he will eventually join them and leave the village. Now, Okonko had so much respect in this village, but he destroyed. Let me give you an example of the respect that he had. When he became an elder, and this is for me probably one of the best moments in African literature, aesthetically speaking, but also in terms, everybody talks about African art, the masks, the ancestor worship, and so on, and how you get the vital spirit from the ancestors. Well, you put on a mask and you dance, and through the rhythm, the spectators and everything, the ancestors' spirit flow into your body, and you get the vital force, and you are blessed. And that's how they also make judgments. In order to make the judgment, everybody put on a mask. So when you do this masquerade, you're no longer yourself. You're no longer yourself. You are an ancestor figure, and you are dancing. And what is brilliant about this novel is that Okonko, as an elder, was one of the people who wore the mask. His wives knew that he was limping. Other people knew this, but nobody dare acknowledge that he was Okonko because he was at that moment an ancestor figure. He had become one with the ancestors. And really, that's what African art, that's the definition of African art, traditional art that influenced the Picassos, the Epsteins, the Braques, all the European modernists, the Fauvistes, the Cubists, and so on. So Achebe has succeeded in putting all that in a mise-en-scène. The role of the mask, the role of the ancestor, and the elder putting on the mask in order to pass a judgment, including the killing of Ikemefuna, of course, including the time, some people kill somebody from Umuafia and they have to declare war. So everything comes from this Supreme Court that you call, the mask dance,
I think of the Supreme Court partly because it's on everybody's mind, and partly because that court in our country sits in judgment, invoking the text of the Founding Fathers, which was written over 200 years ago by a few men, and they actually dress up in robes. It's a very ritualized performance to actually embody the intention or spirit, even if you're not an originalist.
Of course, it's like things fall apart.
So we all do this. So in some ways you're saying this is what Achebe puts in front of us, is to be in touch or be possessed by the spirits of your ancestors gives you a kind of power to be in the present. So Okonko is
and to be neutral.
Interesting.
And to be neutral, because even though he's limping, people can no longer recognize him because he has become an ancestor.
So it's not Okonko speaking, who is embedded in his village, has relations, but it's neutral. He can abstract himself. He can actually speak on behalf of some other principle.
Exactly. He had become an ancestor figure. He's no longer Okonko. Right. So it's very much...
It's kind of how Achebe is actually novel. He doesn't speak as Achebe anymore and about Igbo culture specifically, but you're saying through this specificity, we can see something that actually transcends that or leaves that in a way.
Yeah, and this brings us back to your point, the question that you raised earlier of white people coming, colonizers coming to this area, which Achebe, in many ways, he has at least 2 points to make in the encounter between the people of this village, Umuafia, and the European colonizers, including anthropologists, including the missionaries, and the commissioner from UK.
The bureaucracy and the military.
Yes. So when this encounter happens, Achebe, for me, is saying two things. You come to us, you think we have no civilization, we think we have no identity. Here we are a country that has Okonko, and next to Okonko you also have Obierika. So, two very complex characters. One is very much open, negotiate, understand situation, identify with people, and he's complex. That's Obierika. The other one is upholding the masculine identity of the tradition. So they all fit in this tradition the same way. You will have your Achilles or your, I don't know, Aeneid.
Or you have your Hamlet and you have your Othello.
Exactly. So he's making that point. And then he also had this powerful, ironic moment toward the end of the novel where the district commissioner said, oh, these people are interesting, because Achebe had hung himself. He said, these people are interesting. Maybe I will write one paragraph.
This is the paragraph right here, right? So he says, so the district commissioner decides, he says, every day brought him some new material. He thought about the book he would write. The story of this man who had killed a messenger and hanged himself would make an interesting reading. One could almost write a whole chapter on him. Perhaps not a whole chapter, but a reasonable paragraph at any rate. There was so much else to include, and one must be firm in cutting out details. He had already chosen the title of the book, after much thought, The Pacification of the Primitive Tribes of the Lower Niger. So this is the end of Achebe's novel, where for a moment he says, if a white man had written this book, it would be a sentence, but I just gave you the complexity of an entire civilization, of how the world is actually constructed through our participation in it, resistance to it, failure, successes. And if I hadn't written this novel that you've now been absorbed in, you would have known a sentence.
That's right.
So the last sentence, it's a kind of interesting change that Achebe almost gives over the voice at the last paragraph to this white person and says, actually, nothing would have been achieved. We wouldn't know the humanity of anybody.
Well, it's an amazing moment in the novel, because on the one hand, he changed the narrative, the narratological mode of the novel. It suddenly became an irony. Ironically, look at how these people, they think my culture only deserves one paragraph. So, you have an authorial intervention in some ways. And do we accept it or not accept it? So there was that challenge. When I read that intervention, I love the fact that he's telling the reader that Igbos in Umuafia had a very complex culture. And he's right to elaborate on that. But as a reader of the novel, because that's what I do, European, then I say, why is he speaking? Why am I hearing this voice? But that's just my own perversion or derisory approaches to things. But it was an incredible moment, because Achebe, Things Fall Apart is telling us that Okonko was thinking in his own world, and the in is important, whereas Obierika is acting in his own world but thinking with the world, seeing changes coming from my world. How do I deal with these different changes? I'll win some, I'll lose some, and so on. But Okonko is the one who's not compromising. And ironically, for the Igbos who do not believe in suicide, that's the worst abomination in Igbo culture. They don't do suicide. So Okonko become this person sacrilegious, this person who actually, in his attempt to defend the tradition, is breaking all the rules, because he's not having it his own way. And he's not different from the colonizer. Because the colonizer also, when when white people come to these places, whether Africa, Latin America, wherever they go, the objective is to discover the world. Now, you can't discover these people, they have been there. The objective is you conquer them. And then the objective is to civilize them, to give them a religion. And we have already seen in Things Fall Apart that these people have an intricate, a very complex religion that is able to take care of, justice, that's able to take care of the everyday life, that's telling you when it is a holiday, when it, is a work day. So their whole lives had been organized in a very sophisticated manner. But this is what Europeans just come, they don't see it because they are like Okonko. They don't think with the world. They just come with their culture and impose their culture. If Okonko had power, he probably would have been a colonizer too.
And I like what you said, that this is irony, deep irony in the sense. So when people say this is the first, it's not literally the first chronologically, the first African novel written by an African in English, they don't say, oh, finally the English language also got an African to contribute to the great canon. Yes, actually what Achebe is doing with this deep irony, he's saying, we've been here all along. You pretend we didn't exist. I didn't need to add anything to your canon. I'm writing something, and T.S. Eliot once said something, every work of art changes the entire preceding canon in fundamental ways. It reorganizes everything. So Things Fall Apart reorganizes the understanding of the novel, not it's another novel we add to all the great novels. But now we have to think differently about what the novel can do and is.
Well, again, we are in the English language. If we stay in the English language, I think, you originally Germanophone and I'm Francophone. And so if you compared French, German to the English language, what happened first is that the English language was able to produce the American literature that's completely different from the English novel, the Australian literature, the Canadian literature. And Achebe opened the door for the African literature in the English language that's not English. And this is so important because all the writers, whether they like Achebe or didn't like Achebe, had to measure their writing. They have to take Africa seriously and African cultures and traditions seriously in writing their novels. So that the whole, what they call Hanneman series, Hanneman was the publisher of African writers, all the authors actually created a literature in English that's different from the American literature, that's different from the British literature, the so-called Commonwealth literature, that's authentically African. You pick up the first 2 pages, you know that this is a novel culture. You're entering in a novel world. Achebe started that with Things Fall Apart. He started that with Things Fall Apart. But he also he honored the novel as that which opened the door to different complexities of the world. So you get to see Africa finally through his eyes, and then through the eyes of all the subsequent writers who came all the way to Chimamanda or Ben Okri or some other wonderful Ngugi wa Thiong'o who wrote great English novels that differences, and this is why I mentioned French and German earlier. When you pick up a French African novel, things are changing, but not much. The language still is Guy de Maupassant. The language is, because you have to do your passé simple. You have to really speak the way people speak French in the tradition of Francité, which is the hexagon. You have to speak French like French people.
The hexagon meaning the country of France, centered in Paris, in the Académie Française. So this is proper and the rest is not valid.
The best writers, even Samben Ousmane earlier, he picked up a novel like Le Docker Noir, all the way to Au Pays Mon Beau Peuple. It's really the French grammar and the French way of syntax, especially the French syntax. You have to say this word, this phrase the way French people speak.
So what Achebe is saying also that a language can be changed from within and from without, and that language is malleable and the novel is malleable.
Absolutely.
So it opens that up.
Yeah, Mark Twain understood it, Achebe for Americans, and Achebe understood it for Africans. This is what is crucial, and it still is the struggle in Francophone literature because we are still trying to speak French like French people. They never allowed us to have a Senegalese French.
So my question for you, Manthia, so you've written a novel. Have you written it in French or in English?
I had to write it in English.
You wrote it in English,
I have
so
the
you
freedom
say there's the freedom, and
to
it's,
invent.
and it's set in Senegal partly. I
Exactly.
read it, it's wonderful, so
Yeah.
hopefully it's coming out soon. So I want to thank you. We could go on. I hope to have you back on the podcast in the
Fine.
future
Yeah.
about another book. So
Yeah.
thank you, Professor Manthia Diawara. I want to point out one thing. You have a film out called The Opera of the World, which was shown at Documenta in Athens and Kassel. It's been touring, it's been screened, so if people are interested, I think they should watch this incredibly moving and powerful film. One of your recent films, you've made many others, you've written books, and I'll put the information how to get more access to your work on the website as well.
Thank you, Uli, my friend.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Bye.